My name is Sherilyn Rose Goodridge. All my family called me Rose. I am the daughter of Charles Arnold Goodridge and Doris Christiana Clemens. My dad's father is James N.D. Goodridge, and James N.D. Goodrich's father is James Abel Goodrich, who went to Liberia from the Barbados on the Cora. Today is especially a good day for me to have a conversation like this because today is my father, Charles Goodrich's birthday. He would have been 101. His birthday was August 27, 1921. I'm talking about a memory or a favorite memory at the home of my grandmother. This is my father's mother, Nancy Caroline Garnett Goodrich Padmore. Oh, we Goodrich ladies like to have last names. But anyway, a favorite memory at that house was I love going to that house because it was just grand. Everything about that house seemed like a big life. And I love it because I remember 3 floors. And as kids, we called it was downstairs, upstairs, and the Holy Ghost is what we called the 3rd floor. And she just had this, for a child, it was this very tall gas light when I never saw anything that fancy in anybody's house. All the lampshades had pretty lace patterns on it. So those things I was always fascinated by. And just the staircase, the intricate work that was on the staircase. So as a child, that was just incredibly, she looked like she was a wealthy woman. So I was just excited to be there. And I remember she had like 4-poster beds in her house with netting around them and everything. Who had curtains around their beds? But she had those things. And every morning it almost seemed like there were almost 18 to 20 lampshades that got washed in that house. And I remember once being able to help the girls wash those lampshades. And you washed everything and they handed them to you, and the washing was being done by hand, and they handed them to you one at a time, and you lined them up until the shades were dry, and then they poured oil into the lamp, into the bottom of the lamp, and turn up the wick and put it on there. So it was interesting. I have tried to explain that to people sometime about my grandmother's house and what it was like to be there. And I always get the question was, what kind of work did your grandmother do? And I thought, no, it wasn't that she worked. That was the style her husband, that was the kind of people they were. They entertained people that came there. They entertained the church when people, and some of her kids came on Sunday for church. So that was the big gathering place. I guess that would be the place most people call like the family house. That was the central point. It was like her house for me was the centerpiece of the family because that was the only house we all gathered to at the same time. If a lot of people were there, that was the house. So those are the kind of memories. I just thought my life would be so big because that was the image I saw of my life, a big life being in that house. That's what it reminded me of. So I always thought I had pleasant memories being there. Well, yeah, we at that house also they had the kerosene icebox. Today, people call it refrigerator, but as a child, I knew it was an icebox that they had to put kerosene in for it to work. And as kids, sometimes they will ask you to hold the ice tray so somebody could open it and put the ice tray back in. And then there was this little mechanism that felt like a little lever you had to push back and forth to release the ice, to release the ice cubes. And then they will pour it out, and then you put it back, and then they'll fill it up with water and put it inside. And also the other thing I remember, anyone who came to sleep, if it was a guest or a minister, you had to, there was a little basin. It was round and then it had a tall filter to it. And it sat, one sat in the corner on a table in every room. I don't know where she got those, but those were kind of pretty. Like if it was in one room and it was pink, the bottom around the tray was pink, and then the pot was pink. It was like an oversized clay teapot. Oh, that's what it looked like. And so the person would just have to pour the water in the basin, and then they'll wash up, and then they'll have more water to do whatever they needed to do. So those things were kind of interesting for me, seeing what people had to go through to stay there. It was all part of the hospitality that she provided. Today, I think if you went to, sometimes I think I would see that in a vintage bed and breakfast or something like that. That's what I keep thinking. Someday I'm going to walk into an old bed and breakfast and see those things sitting in the corner. But those were some of the things I remember about being in that house. Yeah, so I talked about the lampshades, the big, the oversized pitcher, the pitcher and the water uh, that were set in the room, and then there was the banister. We would go up the stairs and slide down. It was just the most fun thing to do, even though we knew we weren't supposed to do it, but that was what we did. You could just slide up and down there. And then upstairs in the, there was a, what we call a parlor. I'm not sure if that's what they call them everywhere, but we call them call it the parlor. And so if she had a wedding, that was where the wedding actually took place. And that was when I remember Sister Teresa got married there, right? And you were a flower girl, and so was Maureen, and you guys were all dressed up with little white gloves on. And I came standing in to watch everything that was going on. So the wedding took place up there, and then everybody kind of came down for the reception. But that was like a really big occasion to be held in a house. I couldn't understand that, but everything was held in that house. It seemed the house was big enough to accommodate any kind of occasion you wanted to host. And that was what she did. And she had enough people. The people who help, you wouldn't say you hired a staff to come. The staff were all of her grandchildren. You know, whoever was living there were part of the staff. You came and you did what you had to do. Somebody brought the water and somebody fluffed up the chairs, and these chairs were big. If I remember them, that was where. And if she had a private guest, because sometimes I would remember Auntie Comfort would come after church, because I remember one particular Easter Sunday. And so if grandma was sitting up there, and then everybody went up there to sit and talk to her. So it feels like she was having her own private session. That was where people came and had their conversation. And if they were downstairs on the porch, that meant everybody else could hear what was going on or what the conversation was about. But if you went up there, it didn't necessarily mean anybody could be up there. That means all kids needed to be heard and to be seen and not heard. And so that was the kind of place it was. So I really liked going there. It was the grand affair.
And Rose, one thing I remember, you talk about the upstairs parlor, but that upstairs parlor, what happened was for the centenary, Crozierville, the 100th anniversary of Crozierville's existence, my grandfather, Jacob Padmore, had the upstairs parlor turned into a bedroom for his niece, cousin Nettie, Mrs. Antoinette Padmore Tutmer, who was married to President Tutmer. They were supposed to come to Crozierville for the centenary celebration. And he went through a lot. He bought new furniture from Jansen, had that new rocks, oriental rock on the floor, had that room, the parlor, had it set up for the president and his wife when they came to Crozierville. If they needed to, so he thought they would spend the night in Crozierville. They'll have, because they didn't have hotels in Crozierville. So that would be where they would stay at her uncle's house, Jacob and Nancy Patmore's house, in that house. And that room became, after that, became Cousin Nettie's room. We all refer to it as Cousin Nettie's room. And what happened was they came to Crozierville for the celebration, but they didn't spend the night. They went back to Monrovia on the day they had the occasion. But the room, the upstairs parlor had been turned into a fabulous bedroom for Cousin Nettie. And then later, from that day, we refer to it as Cousin Nettie's room.
Wow. Grandma was this, the way I remember her, she was just this steady little lady. She wasn't a tall person. She was this stocky young lady with her legs. I was fascinated by her legs. Oh my God. She would just take her time and step to everything. They were not oversized, but she just had herself a pair of legs. And I could just look at her. She just commanded so much for her height. She just commanded a lot. It was like she was the master project manager. She spoke just outright. She was very direct with what she wanted done and what needed to be done. And sometimes she didn't have to say anything. She would just look and somebody knew what to do. And a lot of times I think of how she commanded her sons with all that they carried on with. When they came over to her, she just, with a look, with a move of her hands, they were quiet. Everybody that came to that yard, she was the central figure in that yard. Even though, Patty was there, it was Patty's house, but Patty wasn't there all the time. I seemed to see him mostly on weekends. I didn't really see him during the week. And when he was there on the weekends, he either had his robe and it was wrapped and or he was dressed from head to toe. He was just always dressed up for everything. Whether he was going to bed or he was going to have dinner, he was just always dressed up. But she always moved around the house. She moved around everything. She was there when they were cooking, when they were baking. I remember being sent downstairs because I think the house was high enough that we could go under the house because the house was on pillars. And if she was making bread, we went on the outside because she didn't want us running through the house. So she wanted the bread to rise. And she said if we were running, the bread would fall. So we went downstairs. We didn't go downstairs. We went under the house. That was where we went. And there was always flowers in the yard. I don't know who planted the flowers. I don't know what was going on, but there was always lots of beautiful hibiscus and other flowers. So I really enjoyed being down there. It was a sight to see as a child. And I thought the house was so big. For me, the house was just oversized until I saw it later in life. My favorite memory of my father was always playing Ludo with him. Because he always played with me. That was the one thing I could do with him. I could play Ludo. And he was always willing to play a prank on somebody. So being there, I knew I would laugh. If he was there, he would laugh. Some adult would be made fun of. So I would always, that was the thing. He and I just played Ludo, and no matter what we played, I was always game to it. I would play 6-4, kick and lay. We would play slavery. We would play every game, and he would play me like he was playing an adult. And we would play and just laugh, and he would be laughing out loud. Cat, 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 cat. That's his laughter was just so hard and loud. And that would be the thing we would do. And I remember we played one day, we played with my Uncle John. And oh my God, my father lost the game. And it was me and Bajon playing that game. And every turn, I just kept winning. And my father would just laugh. I mean, he would fall all over the floor. He would just, I mean, his arms would be flailing all over the place, just that I was winning. So for me, that was a favorite memory. Another favorite memory I had of him was that I watched him protect us uh, in a car accident. I didn't know it was a car accident, but we had gone to spend Christmas. When I say we, my two brothers and I, Carlos, Pablo, and myself, we were little kids, and they had taken us to my mother's sister in Harrisburg. We had gone for the holiday, and my father came up because he ran the transportation, but he didn't want to leave us there. He wanted to bring us home for the New Year's. And everybody begged him not to bring us, not to take us, because they thought he had been drinking. But he took us, and when we were somewhere in White Plains, and the truck broke down, he had all of us in the front with him, and there was a little girl named Dorothy that used to be with us. She used to help my mother take care of us. And I just heard my father screaming because there was a nearby sugar cane farm, and he was rolling in the cane farm and he was shouting. My children are in the car. And at first we didn't know what he was talking about because we were little. We couldn't open the truck. We were just sitting there. But Mr. John Andrews, who was his buddy, had heard the cry and came over. What had happened, the car broke down. He went under the car with a lantern, and the truck caught fire. And realizing, and his arms, both his arms were on fire, but realizing what was about to happen, before he started rolling in the farm, he kicked the lantern from under the truck so the truck wouldn't get on fire. But he was on fire, but the truck wouldn't get on fire. And a few days later, I went to the hospital to visit him and saw him all bandaged up and everything. So that for me was one of the first times I realized that my father really loved and cared for us, because at that age, I just thought nobody risked their life for someone else unless they cared that much, because it was scars, many scars he would live with for the rest of his life. In Liberia, we call them plums. But we had one tree behind the house. For us, we just had fruit galore because there was a coconut tree, there was pawpaw tree, avocado tree, cashew tree. We call them crusoe in Liberia. Guavas, bittersweet. Everything was in that little yard. It was one yard with so many things. But I remember I would sit on the steps on the side of the house waiting to hear and I would hear a butter pear drop because we could not pick them if they were not ready. And they always used to say when the fruit is ripe enough, it will fall by itself, or you have to shake them or something. So as a child, I couldn't pick the fruit. So I just sat there and waited for it. and I would go out early in the morning with a bucket and pick all the mangoes from under the tree. So those were things I really enjoyed. I thought there were things everybody else enjoyed. So, but he never sold any of them. That was the thing, because whenever he took a lot of the fruit off the tree, he put them in different pans, the little dish pans that they used to have, and he would say, "Take this down the street to Nancy. Take this over to John. Take this over to Jim." Everybody had a little bit. Take this over to Miss Julia. Take this to Ann Lou. So we had the whole street, and not that he was sending me, but whoever was in the yard, he was sending them to give these fruit to everybody. Take this down over to Teacher Lee, so everybody would get some of it. He didn't sell his fruit. Between jolobo and castor oil and herb tea. Herb tea came in a little box, and they would just give you that thing, and it was the nastiest thing ever. And I don't know why they gave us castor oil, but this is something I remember because my mother's mom was a midwife. So she used to tell her, I guess she had learned a lot of things from her. So my mom would say, when the moon changes, you have to take this worm medicine. That's what she used to say to us. And it was this big, round, pink tablet. Today, I don't like any flavors of strawberries or orange. If it's not the real thing, I don't want it, because that's what that medication tasted like. It was this big thing, and they would make you chew it because you couldn't swallow it. It was almost like they used to have the metal dollar before, where Liberian people call it a bull dollar. It was this big round thing. So the medication was about that big, and they would make you chew it. And the after effects was, once you took that medication, then you needed to take castor oil or herb tea. And if somebody didn't go to Monrovia in time to come back with some herb tea, you had jolobo. Oh God, it was so bitter. And you had no choice. You just stood there and kind of drank it. but that was what we did. And then we had catnip tea on a daily basis to give you catnip. And oh God, I can't remember all the things, but catnip was a major tea. And Spanish nettle. In Liberia, we would say, go get the Spanish needle. But Spanish nettle was one of the things we drank all the time. And what we call it in Liberia sour. And I think a lot of the Caribbean countries will call it hibiscus tea. And they're red, but when they're not overripe or dry, they're green. So those were some of the medicinal things that we drank. We drank it for medicinal purposes. And it's called sorrel. That's the thing. That's the Caribbean name I remember, sorrel. But we call it sour in Liberia. It's green, and when you boil it, the water is just red. And we drank it with no sugar. Nothing was added. You just drank it. So those are my memories of medicinal things. And later, my mom would say she used the Christmas bush. I don't know if you know the Christmas bush leaves. And she would take it if anyone had a cut, and she would roll it up and squeeze the water from it, because she said it was anesthetic. And that was what they used also. Games we played. Well, I think a lot of the games, because our family, I guess because of the family background, a lot of the games we play hopscotch, and we played ring around the roses and stuff like that. And I remember go in and out the window and all of those things, because the books were, some of the books were American, so you read the teachers learned them from there. And I think also my mom grew up near a mission school, so some of the games that she taught the kids in school were games that had been passed down to her. And we would play things like, please, please drop it. Please, please drop it. I wrote a letter to my darling on the way he dropped it. Little boy, pick it up and put it in his pocket. Please, please. And we would be running around. Oh my God. And most of the time we played a lot of games on Friday because it seemed like Friday after the recess, it was just a day, afternoon that we could do a lot of outdoors activity and the other thing was the schoolyard was in my uncle's yard was the schoolhouse, but Blake House was the schoolhouse, and so his yard was also the school ground. And I remember when they brought care food and they would distribute the care goods to us on a Friday. So I think that was one of the reasons why after the lunch break on Friday, we spent most of the time outside, because then they would line the kids up to know how to distribute the food. And they gave each family like a bag of flour, a bag of cornmeal, a bag of bulgur wheat, and you would get butter, oil, and those, and you would get apricot baby food, the Gerber baby food. For some reason, we got all the apricot version of it, but those were the things and that they brought. So while the teachers were sorting out the food with the older kids, we were out playing, and we just played a lot of games with each other. And not to mention, I guess the boys played soccer and the girls, we were playing rings, whatever it was, we were there playing. Well, whenever the country cook was always like a big celebration. I remember it more because my mother's family had it more. But I remember whenever they had country cook, everybody cooked. It was almost like potluck. But when they cook, the food that they cook was mostly Liberian dishes. So you had your cassava leaves and potato greens and flowers and palawa sauce and fufu. Those were the things they cooked. And the biggest thing I remember about country cook, everybody ate with their hands. Nobody ate with spoons. And people ate with age groups. So you would put all the 8-year-old boys, maybe 4 of them, to a bowl. And that's how you would divide the food, because the people would be so many, no one had to bring that many plates out. So whatever bowls they cook in, they would just take those big pans and just sit the kids around the pan, like a ring around the pan. And each one of the kids just ate in front of themselves, ate with your hand. And so that's sort of how the country cook was. And they made punches, and they made fruit punch. They made whatever juice they could put together, a lot of times ginger beer. So all of us learned to drink things with ginger in it from the time we were little, because most of the juices and stuff was done with the fruits that we had. And they would make them and bring them, but primarily country cook happened at something like the school ground. The last day of school would be a day of country cook, because we would be celebrating the closing of school. And so there would be food for everybody, and they would cook there. That's how that was. And then the other kind of celebration was parade day. I don't know how and when Crozierville was chosen to be the place, but I guess it was one of the areas on the district where they had to have parade day. And so we would call them, I guess today they would be considered like vendors, but everyone will come and bring their little, we call it their little market business, or their little waiter market. And they would bring it, some people brought different things to sell, and especially foods. A lot of times it was on the parade field that was not next door to my father's property, but across from Miss Julia Williams' house. And everybody dressed up in there. If you had a parent in the military and that wasn't a woman, it seemed everybody in the military at that time were men, and they all came there to drill because it was like a performance. It was a grand performance. They had the band, and my father had to walk next to, I don't know who, I didn't remember Mr. Alfred Menza's rank at the time, but apparently he was almost like a general or a captain. I don't know who he was, but he was there, and my father would take him, and it was almost like the the crossing of the guards or something. I don't know what that was, but they would walk up the field, and you would see the eyes right, and he would be there to give it. And it was quite a thing. The whole town stood up. Everybody stood at the field to watch these men do this parade, and everyone was there to cheer them on. And they made potato poon, cassava bread, rice bread, shortbread. You would have everything imaginable. Coconut candy, milk candy. You you found everything there. That was part of that celebration. Most of the things I talked about are my happiest memories of Crozierville, because I think at the time I lived in a bubble, because I didn't know what happened in the rest of the world. My whole family lived on the same street. I had uncles and cousins up and down the street. It seemed like I was related to everybody there. And as a small child, I think it brought a level of security, thinking that, everybody was yours. You call everybody cousin, you call everybody auntie, you call everybody sister, and one of the things I learned in Crozierville, and I think I learned it from Crozierville first, and then I learned it from my mother's family, was that we were all first cousins, but your first cousin was your sister or your brother. So they weren't cousin this, cousin anything. They were just your sister and your brother. And then all the ones that were older than you, that were 2 or more years older than you, the women, you would call them sister something, and the men would be brother something, So, and that was just life. So you were related to everybody. And we went all the way down to Aunt Kit, Aunt Jerusha, my Ella. We went Aunt Lou. I never knew what relationship we had to Aunt Lou, but she was Aunt Lou. And don't forget, there was that creek that ran behind Aunt Lou's house. The creek was this little spring out of a rock that came through the hills. We never saw the actual source of this thing, but it trickled into a creek. And every family got drinking water from that creek. So it was like a major thing. You saw, as you got older, you could go to the creek. It was like an outing for the day. You could go to the creek in the evening to get drinking water. So those were the kinds of things. Some of my happiest were the first time I was allowed to go to the store to buy. I went to buy soap, and I was allowed to go by myself all the way to Bensonville. So even though I wasn't far from the border, but I was allowed to go to Bensonville. So I had to pass Miss Julia's shop and go all the way up and go up to Bensonville and go to the vice president's store. I had to go to Talbot's shop to buy soap that day. And my mother sent me, and I don't know how many other people were watching me on the road, but everybody asked me, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to Willitaba Shot." So I cannot imagine the age I was doing all of these things, but it just seemed like that was the world that we lived in. Because I had to go by Miss Julia, I had to go by Miss Melinda Dixon's house. You remember she had two girls, Airline and Vic. They were
Yeah.
right by the monument. Her and her
Yes.
husband lived there, and you could just go past their house to go down. And that was the junction to the Oshoko's new house where the midwife was. Father had many business ventures. Um, he At one time he had a transportation business that he called and so what, and he would drive his truck every morning from Crozierville to White Plains and into Harrisburg about 5:30 in the morning, and he will pick up his passengers, and he will come back and go through Harrisburg and go to Monrovia. And in the evening, he would bring them back the same way. So if you went on the truck in the morning, you knew you had a seat on the truck to come back unless you weren't coming back. And so he ran that business for a while. He was the only person running transportation at that time. Um, and after that, I remember him doing business. He built houses. He built a house for everyone except himself. He built all his brothers' houses, and he built some of his friends' houses. He was busy. He was busy in that little corridor of Lemongrass Street. It's interesting because everything we're talking about happened on one street, Lemongrass Street. That was it. But and after that, later, after my mother left, he went into his farming business. He pretty much, as a child, I remember him growing everything, all his fruit and vegetables. If he got a new fruit, he just took the seed out and he threw it right out or planted it, and the next thing you knew, something was there. And basically, for food, he mostly bought rice. He wouldn't buy anything else because he raised animals and he didn't have to buy meat. He would, if he killed a hog or whatever, he would use some of the meat. He would roast some. He would cure some. Just that was. He would dry some of it. That was the kind of person he was. He thought he could live an independent life and not be subject to going to work. I mean, he worked because by 5:30 in the morning he was out. Whatever he was doing, he said, if he was on the farm, he had to be finished doing his hardest work by 12. Because what most people didn't realize, in Liberia, by 12 o'clock, it was literally too hot to do anything if you were working outside. It was too hot. So you had to work in the morning and then get off at 12 and then maybe go back to your work at 2 o'clock when the sun started to go down is when he would go. And then when he moved to the interior, what I realized what he was doing there was he would set up his mill or his still, and as other people in the area would plant their sugar cane, they needed someone to grind the cane. And so he would be the place where they came to grind the cane and still the rum and everything. And then he would collect a toll from from whoever brought the sugar cane. And that was how they paid him. He collected a toll for them using his mill, using the still, whatever. That was what he did. And So he would have multiple things going on. He had the farm going on, and then on Saturday, today this person was scheduled to do their sugar cane, and they would bring it all, and that was that was the life he lived. So much so that when the war came, he told me he dug a hole and buried his still. He dug a hole in Crozierville on the farm and buried his still, hoping that when the war was all over, he would go back and he would be able to dig it up and restart his life. But that was what he did before he moved to Monrovia, because he was one of the last people to give up moving to Monrovia during that war. So he spent time, when he felt that there was nothing else he could do, he started to bury all of his equipment. But also, for the time he grew up in, he just thought men were everything, because he always just talked about how if a man couldn't control his woman and stuff like that. And I always challenge him, because I would always say, "What do you mean?" I would always just talk to him about that and say, "No, that woman had the right to be who she was, and not what you think she should be." And he couldn't understand why I spoke the way I did. I didn't understand why I spoke the way I did either. But my father spoke the Pele language, and he understood a little bit of Gola. But when I say he spoke the Pele language, he spoke broken Pele. So they understood, and so they laughed at him a lot, but that didn't stop him. He spoke it anyway. Even though they were laughing, when he spoke that language, he said it, he tried his darndest best, and he spoke it because he knew he had moved into a different territory. He had moved into a whole different tradition, and he needed to learn how to live among the people he was living in. And actually, I should say, thankfully to him, as a child, I recognized that there were other traditions in Liberia outside of the one I was growing up in, or the one I knew. Because all of a sudden I realized that people did things differently. And it wasn't because it was the law or it wasn't the law, that was their tradition. Like when the girls came from the Sanders Society, I always liked to watch, because they were dressed, they were beautifully dressed, they had all these jewelry all over them, but they were practically naked. But I didn't understand that was part of what was supposed to be done. And they said at this time they were looking for suitors for them, or their husbands. And I thought the girls were too young, because that was my tradition. At least that's what I was thinking. But when I come to think about it now, that wasn't totally the tradition, because they married a lot of girls very young. But these girls were really little. And I learned that the nature of courtship was very different. And I thought, oh my God, I remember my first realization. I said, oh, Liberia is two different societies. That was what I said. I said, Liberia is two different societies, because I think I saw that people had a man could have three or four wives, and then in Monrovia you could only have one wife. Indigenous tradition that people could have more than one wife. A man could have more than one wife. And in Monrovia, the culture that it had its impact from the Western world or whatever, it was one man, one wife. But I'm not gonna say any more than that, because yeah, In the church, it was one man and one wife, but it certainly was different. When it comes to education, I think that was my mother's track. My mother's family was so big on education. My father thought if you just had a skill and you could do it well, that was enough for you. He didn't have to invest in your education. But my mom would sell the clothes off her back to make sure her kids were educated. Because her family grew up um, in the church with the church schools. All the kids went to school. It was a big thing. You made something of yourself if you were educated. So my mom would stop at nothing. Education was primary. If you did nothing else, you had to go to school. Whereas I didn't see that with my father. You went to school, yeah, he wanted you to go to school, but he wasn't going to push it one way or another. It didn't mean that much to him. If you did, he was happy. But my mother, that was it. You went or else. I went to I went to a little kindergarten school in Burrville. I don't remember the name of the school, but we called the woman Teacher Sinovia. I went to that school, I think kindergarten or something. And then I went to Crozierville Government School. That's how I know the school was under Blake's house. And I remember when they built the new school. And then I went to um, for about a year or so, I lived with my father on his farm in the Dingola area. And when I went to Todi to the gym, they had a school there. They had a little schoolhouse there. So I went there for a little while. And then I went to St. Peter's Lutheran School. And when I graduated sixth grade, I went to the high school, the Lutheran Training Institute in Salaye, Lufa County. It was a long way from home, but I loved going to that school. I feel like it's the one school that the first school that I had total resolve for. That school helped me to become an independent person. I learned that if I didn't wake up when the bell rang, there was a consequence for that, and I needed to take responsibility for that. I didn't have mother, father, sister, brother, or anyone there to wake me up. If the bell rang, I woke up. I needed to get myself dressed. No one told me to to do my homework. When the bell rang and it was study hall, I made my way there to the school and I did what I had to do. Everything I needed to take responsibility for myself. And that was what I did. And at that school, I made many friends. I found my voice. I already had a voice, but I made a few really good friends. And one of my friends signed me up for the cultural troupe because their cultural troupe had won a contest the president had put up and they had gone to Kenya. So the year I was there, I got picked to be on the cultural troupe. I didn't know any traditional dances, but at least I could sing. So I was part of the singing group. And that group traveled to Ethiopia with the president for the OAU conference. And I remember saying to someone one day, I said, "Oh, I remember having the emperor give us a private tour when we were in Ethiopia." And this is someone from Ethiopia. And they said, "You met His Excellency?" And I was saying, "Yeah, I did." I said, "Oh, as a child, I did go there." And he was this very small, this petite man, but he was very generous to us. And I said, "I danced for the emperor." So that's one of the things. And I say sometimes I never think about it that way, but in a conversation like this, I'm remembering that that was one of the things that happened with me as a child, and helped me to understand that Liberia was also part of a bigger world, because I didn't know that our president was also playing a major part in the Organization of African Unity at the time. And so we traveled with them, and then we went back home. And the president had said to us, if any one of you want to come back here to school when you graduate high school, you can come back to Ethiopia and go to university. President William R. Talbot. Yeah, we traveled with him. We traveled as diplomats, and our plane was called Speedy. That was very interesting. That was a very interesting trip from the Lutheran Training Institute. And then I left there and went to the CWA, the College of West Africa. And at the time, I had no idea that I would be adding my name to the list of people from Crozierville and the list of Goodridges that had graduated from that school. I was simply looking for a school to go to, and I took the entrance, and I was able to go there. We had a really nice young man who was the tour guide, our tour guide. And he was really nice. He took us to his family on the outskirts of Addis. We stayed in Addis Ababa, but they had just built a hospital. But before they opened the hospital, they used the building as hotels to host the delegates for the OAU conference. And after the president had asked us as a group, what did we want? And we said we wanted this young man to come to Liberia. And that fall, when we went back to school, because for us that would be like the second semester or whatever, we went back to school in August, and he came to visit with us. It was so nice to see him, that he actually traveled to Liberia to visit us. So it was, so that school played a major role in my life in helping me to move on. If I lived there and survived there and learned a lot of things about the interior parts of Liberia, I knew I could make it in any place, because I was young going there and just learning to live with people that had come from different backgrounds. And what most people don't know, the Lutheran Church, the Muhlenberg mission that my uncle Jonathan went to, was in the Harrisburg, the Millsburg part, was where the men went to school. And across the river was the women's school called the E.V. Day Memorial School. Everyone was in Harrisburg, so you just crossed the river. So they kept the girls on one side of the river and the men on the other side of the river. And what the mission school would do later, they decided to move into the interiors of Liberia, and the Lutheran Church then started to build smaller schools. They built more elementary schools, and then they built one big high school, and that high school became the school that all the other schools, when the kids graduated 6th grade, they would then go to that school, because the school was 7 to 12. But I see that Lutheran school, that Lutheran church that the people studied in Harrisburg.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in that church? At one time, the missionaries used to put the dark-skinned people in the back of the church and the light-skinned people in the front of the church. So one Sunday morning, my grandfather and my grandmother, because the whole town used to be Lutherans, and my grandfather and grandmother formed a revolution, and they marched up to where the people called the Marcoffin area, and they started the Herd Ebenezer AME Church. And then the other people, the Wrights, the Browns, they went down the street closer to towards White Plains, and they started the St. John's United Methodist Church. So you got two
Mhm.
churches starting on the same day in that town.
Mhm.
That was why those people started those churches. And of course, my grandmother was one of three children. She had two older brothers, and she was the darker one of the three. Their parents were from over here because their mother went to Liberia when she was 6 years old.
Mhm.
And she was the darker one. And not only she was the darker one, she was the first one who decided to marry an indigenous man. so, so that's how they formed those churches. They formed those other churches in that place. But right now, when you go, that one big Lutheran church is up there.
Mhm.
And then the smaller churches are up and down the street, we call it. But that, so those people, when they had their own revolution and stuff, I say after they started, when the Lutheran people found these people were having revolution, they said, "Wait, we better get out of this settlement and start going to the interior because these people know too much." That was the norm, and then the people just said no. My mother family was Lutherans originally. Most of the people from Harrisburg, we were grandmother, all of them were Lutherans. I have done many things. So the idea was when I came to the States, the idea was I was going to pre-med and I was going to go to medical school. Well, we all know the story about what happened to Liberia, and I figured your family only have you to think about right now, so to depend on right now, so you had better figure out something. And at the time, I realized I had been sewing in Liberia. I had been making my own clothes, and a lot of other people had started asking me. Actually, when I was on LTI, I had started there because we had a social every other Saturday. So I always had to find a way to make something for myself to make myself presentable there. So I had been building these skills. And so when I thought about it, one of my cousins had come to New York to attend FIT. I was going to school in Maryland. I was at the Tacoma Park Montgomery College, and I was in transition. I was about to transfer to Maryland University at College Park. And what I realized, I could only go into merchandising, I think was what it was called back then. And then my cousin came to FIT, and she was in the pattern making program. And I realized she was doing well, and I thought, well, this is something I like to do. I'm going to see if I can do this. And so I transferred, instead of going to Maryland, I opted for what I thought would be a broader kind of background. So I came to FIT, and I loved every minute of FIT because as much as I went to school I became a pattern maker, an industrial pattern maker, but I also went on to get my bachelor's as a textile person. So, so that was something that I learned. And in my training, I had learned that I didn't have to work for anyone. I could work for myself. That's the biggest learning experience in FIT because everything we did, every piece that I put out, I knew it could be presented on its own. I didn't have to wait for someone to do something. So I did that. And then as when I got married to with Mark and had my second child, I had changed, and in that process, I started to work in finance. And I did that for a while. Meanwhile, I always continued to design because I wasn't going to go to look for a second job when I already could do handle my own second job. So that was what I did. And also, I went and became a certified yoga instructor. I had been practicing yoga since I went to FIT. It was just a class I thought I would take, but once I took the class, it became a major part of my personal management, I call it. So I realized it was like a tool I had, it was like something I had in my toolkit. So I went ahead to become a certified yoga instructor. And that was something else I did. So even though I work in finance, after work, I went and taught prenatal yoga, regular yoga. I teach yoga for beginners, intermediate, advanced, prenatal, children, chair. So that was a part of my life. And it's still a part of my life that I have a personal practice of my own and that I can share with other people because it's something that brought a lot of peace to my life, a lot of organization, a lot of direction. So I continued that practice. I love all things slimy from Liberia. So, so I would be the palawa sauce, fufu and palawa sauce, okra and palawa sauce. And it's just the raw palm oil version. That's my favorite Liberian food. All things slimy. If it's walla or gallo, whatever they call it, bush flower sauce, those are my favorite Liberian food. It has to be slimy and it has to have palm oil. The other food that I find interesting is tobogi. And I really love the bitter version, the kittle version. All the other versions, no. But the kittle version, because that was one of the things I learned in Salaye. If you are in Salaye and somebody makes tobogi for you, you got the best. You have to eat it. It's so spicy and hot that the tears will be running down your eyes, but you still want to eat it. You're still eating it even though you're crying. You had asked me about any favorite things that my father said and things that they remember. My father always, daddy always said, a man's word is his bond. That was one thing he always said. He said, when you give your word, you must do what you say. Or he would say, if someone calls you and asks you for something and you don't want to do it, you can either say, I don't want to do it or I can't do it, but don't come up with reasons, all of your reasons why. If they did something to you or if their mother did something to you or whatever, he said that all of that doesn't have anything to do with it. You are to be able to say yes or no. And nobody can hold you responsible for either one. But those were the things he said. If there were anything my parents would want me to remember them about, I think mostly it's integrity. My mother was a servant leader. She just served. She just led with her whole heart. She served everybody. There was no distinction. It didn't matter who you were or what or where you came from. My mother would be of service to you. That's just who she was. My father, on the other hand, him and his service, I think more it was just his integrity. He believed what he believed, and he did things. If he said he would do something, he wanted you to count on it. And he always reminded me never get involved in politics because he said politics was not a good place to be in. because you never knew who was really your friend and who was not your friend. Rebecca Clark. Man, that woman used to come every year to the United Methodist Sunday School Convention and bring her little group from Reese Memorial to the United Methodist Sunday School Convention. And she would always have a whole skit for those two. So my Auntie Irie, one time I don't know who wrote this poem, Hillary Teach or somebody wrote this poem, A Woman is Always Right. And I just used to, I found a poem, I would memorize it. If it speaks to me, I memorize it. So I came under the tree and I started saying that poem. My auntie said, "You going with me to the Sunday school convention?" I said, "Okay." I went to that Sunday school convention and I said that poem. They encore that poem twice. I have to go back and say the poem for the people. In the end, so yeah, well, the funny thing, our Goodridge represented St. John United Methodist Church from Harrisburg. And here was another group of Goodridge from Reese Memorial Church. And Cousin James was the president of the Sunday School Convention. He said this first prize go to this Goodridge from St. John United Methodist Church. Yeah, we always used to go. People always used to say, "Hi, you're Goodridge, you come from St. John." We say, "Where our mom from Harrisburg." That's how we come from St. John. But and she didn't go to Methodist church. My mom went to she was African Methodist, but her sister married somebody in the Methodist church. So since her sister used to go to all the St. John's United Methodist Church because she and her children, the Basses, they were in the Methodist church. So that's how come we started going to the Methodist church. And in the end, my mom just used to follow us, go to the Methodist church when she felt like. And from her, I remember just, I go to any church, mommy say go everywhere. So she just started, she would go to wherever she felt like going. I was small. I think Mr. Adolphus Clark died, and my father was in charge of the wake heat because he was in UBF, and the UBF people were supposed to hold, you know how they hold guard over the body. And I don't know what happened with the candles or what it started burning. And so you know I wasn't there. This is just the people that came. They followed my father and say he caused the fire and he caused the casket to burn because he was the brother in charge. I said that night, Daddy told us, but he didn't start no fire and he didn't know how. I mean, they were just after him, but it was so funny that these people were laughing at some fire. The man was dead, but they were talking about fire under the casket. And Daddy said, "No, I don't know how Dolphus Clark." He said that between Dolphus Clark and his God, how the casket started to burn. But it was a serious thing because of it. They had our put came to the house. You know, there's that old man, our put. Well, I don't even know how we used to call him Tisha Put.
Tisha Put. Mm-hmm.
He came to the house with all these men in the middle of the night because they wanted to know how Daddy managed to burn the man casket. You would have thought I was Mr. Alpo father, but I think it was Mr. Adolphus Clark. The noise, the drama were over. The fire started and the people put the fire on. They didn't burn the body or anything. The casket was either the leg or something on the thing caught a fire. And then they started, it was a big drama. That thing. And I could not help myself. Like, what? For future generations, whether it's our children or their children, to pay gratitude to their grandparents or their ancestors. I find that when I was growing up, I learned one of the biggest things for me was I always liked listening to an older person. And any older person who took the time to talk to me, I was so grateful. I just wanted to hear everything they had to say. And so I would encourage young people now to really just ask people any question you're thinking about. What was it like when you were a child? Ask your parents, what was it like? How did you do this? And what I would say to the parents is try not to embellish what was happening in your life. Give the experience as you understood it, as you understood as a child, and now with the reflection point as an adult, what it is, because then you will be giving your kids or your children an honest outlook of what it was like, and you will be really be passing on something to them. Most of them would not remember anything because they're not born in the country. They're growing up in another country. Right now, when Chanel, my older daughter, calls me, if I said, just like I said, I was at this reunion, she said, what were you doing there? Why were you there? Did you graduate from that school? And she said, because I have to write it down. you know, and and the questions you can also ask is, don't be afraid to ask personal questions like illnesses in the family, or sometimes people consider some things as taboo. But I used to ask this question. I would ask my mother, when did you have your period? I would ask my mother-in-law the same question. And I would ask my aunt the same question. When did you start menopause? Because they're people, and I want to know how they went through things like that. Because it comes out in generations, and you don't understand why something is happening to you because you didn't know your history. If you knew your history, you would understand why it was happening. What if a family has a history of little girls having their period at 8 years old, and all of a sudden, 3 generations, you have a little girl at 8, and everybody's coming up with wild ideas as to why that is happening, because they don't know the history of the family. But once you know the history and why and the how and how they dealt with it, then you can do those things. So that would be what I would think people would want to share with children. Just your history. The history of finding that my family could sew, men as well, and I didn't know. So now that it happened to me, I was like, well, I guess this was a natural progression of destiny or fate. I don't know what it was, but just understanding how things happen in your family can help you make a lot of decisions. And what is health wise is you can also understand that just because something is your biology doesn't mean it has to be your biography, because you can manage things when you understand it. And then you can educate your doctor, and instead of having your doctor give you something based on generalities or their limited understanding of what needs to be done. And sometimes we think older people are not willing, or they're not relevant, or they don't have things to say. But they have a lot of things to say. And just like we are talking, remember, someone has had a full life. So there's a lot that not that they have forgotten, there's a lot that they haven't spoken about for a long time that they just won't come up and say unless someone asks a question before they're willing to go ahead and talk about it.